Hello, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for coming, although it's obviously a one-track conference, so I guess you've got no choice. The first thing you might have noticed is that I'm not Greg Young. I 100% apologize for that. I understand that we've already understood that he sent his apologies, so I agreed to come in. They told me about this yesterday, so obviously I've had a lot of preparation. Who am I? I'm a consultant. I now work for Codurance. You may have heard of them, don't know. I was a thought worker for several years, and before that I worked for a startup for 9 years, and I've been working in commercial software since pipelines were a thing for carrying oil, basically. So, what am I going to talk about today? Architects and architecture. So, I've always been a little bit skeptical about what we mean by architecture, and I've kind of been a bit skeptical about what we mean by an architect. So, throughout my career, I've been asking these questions, and so what I'd like to talk a bit about today is, well, what is an architect? What is bad architecture? I'd like to talk about what bad architecture is before we can really start talking about what good architecture looks like, and then at the end, I think I'm starting to understand, but I'm not going to say I'm an expert on what great architecture looks like. Okay, so let's have a bit of context. This person, you might see her coming throughout, or him, don't know if it's a him or a her. I use this device, used to be a picture of a client when I worked for ThoughtWorks, but now we've changed it all to cats. It's Codurance branding. He'll pop up, she will pop up from time to time and tell us about some anti-patterns. So, what's architecture? Interesting question. I have to say, if I asked everybody in this room what is architecture, what is software architecture, I guarantee I would get probably N more answers than there are people in the room. And I know this because I've done it. So this definition on the screen now, this came straight from Wikipedia. It's probably changed since I've downloaded it and copied it off Wikipedia. But if you read through that, like me, you'll probably be absolutely none the wiser about what software architecture is. I know I'm not. That meaning, I think it's meaningless. So this is building architecture. I love these pictures. These I took when I was in Vienna last year. The building on the right was actually the building where the conference was that I was talking. And the reason why I love that picture is if you look at it, it looks like there is some really oddly shaped bridges between the two linked towers there. And you look at that and think, how on earth could you build those bridges with that weird angle in the middle of them? But then if you look really closely, which you probably can't do in the room, you'll actually notice that there is no angle at all. The building on the left is a reflection of the tower, of the bridges going across. And the reason why I love that is because this kind of sums up to me what building architecture is all about. I think we really well understand what the internals of an office block, an office tower are supposed to do, whether that's an office tower, a residential block. We understand that stuff pretty well. And what building architects do, at least in my limited experience, is they kind of design the form of the building rather than the function of the building. I'm sure they have a lot to do with the function as well, but really what we understand and what we see with the architecture is that external form, which is really not what software architecture is at all. So what is software architecture? Well, for a few years, I was asking this question. When I started working for ThoughtWorks, basically every time I went to the pub with my colleagues, which was very often, I would say to them, what does architecture mean to you? And so I kind of started gathering these answers and seeing how many different answers there were. So here's some of them. All the important stuff. Everything that requires a conversation with another team, that's not a bad definition. Maybe that's architecture. The shared understanding of the system design. Yeah, seems reasonable, but ill-defined. Stuff that doesn't change very often. Yeah, okay. That might have been a good definition 10 years ago. I'll come back to that. The bits that link together the distributed systems. Okay. And things that require documentation, I heard said a few times, which kind of disturbed me. But anyway, okay, I had to change the next few slides. By the way, this short notice thing was great because I first gave this deck 2 or 3 months ago in Poland, and we just got a new designer at Codurance, and he was helping me to rebrand some of my ThoughtWorks stuff into Codurance stuff, and he was working on a presentation I've got to do in Belgium tomorrow. And I went to him yesterday afternoon and said, I need this one by lunchtime tomorrow. So if there's anything that goes a bit wonky on the style, you know, I'm going to hold my hands up, but hey. So who knows about architecture? Well, one person that might know about architecture is Martin Fowler. I still respect Martin, obviously. This is a talk that he gave on architecture. He said if you take all your shared understanding and the stuff that's hard to change, that gives you the important stuff, whatever that is. And there's his definition. That's a really good video, probably much better than my talk if you're interested. It's only a 15-minute video. I personally love the thing in the top right. And one thing that I always say to the software teams that I work in is, this decision we're making, how hard will it be to change that going forward? If it's a relatively simple thing to change, do we need a conversation about it? Go ahead and do it. So for me, I really like that definition. I think it's quite powerful. It's simple enough so that people understand it, but it's powerful enough that it's really useful. So for me, I think about that a lot. Architecture is the sum of all the decisions that you've made that are hard to change. I think that's a useful definition. Not the only definition by any means. Okay, so now we're on to the thorny subject of what is an architect. Is anybody in this room an architect? There's one or two. Normally at tech conferences, there are more people put their hands up to that question. There's a bit of a wibbly-wobbly there. My client that I'm working for now for Codurance said, oh, we need someone to be an architect, and I sort of sucked it up and went, okay, I'll pretend to be an architect. So what's an architect? Well, I think, as I said, we well understand a building architect. Does anybody know who that lady is? No? Oh, hand up there. Shout it out, go on. Well played, Zaha Hadid. She was an architect. She died 3 or 4 years ago. I can't remember exactly when. She's famous for lots of buildings that have curvy form to them. That's her sort of signature. She designed the aquatic park in the London Olympic Park, the aquatic building, amongst a lot of other things. So I love her architecture. I mean, I want to go to Baku just to see the Baku Cultural Center that she designed. So I think we understand what a building architect is. But what about a software or a technology architect? What is that? Well, I think in my experience, I've come across lots of different forms and functions of these types of architects. So you do find architects that still write code, although not often. You find those that don't write code. I think that they're probably in the wrong order if we talk about primacy. There are some architects that work very closely with development teams, which I think are probably more effective, but that's open to question, obviously. And you find some that are sort of policymakers, which starts to trouble me a little bit. Interestingly, and I will come back to this, I think you sometimes find architects that have been promoted up through the building and through the organization, and they still find that they're part of maybe a database tribe or a front-end tribe or this sort of thing, and they have a worldview that is dominated by the places that they came from. And then you get these people that sit in their ivory towers, towers of knowledge. How useful that is, well, I don't know. Those that over-design stuff, I don't remember that bullet point. I reckon that got added. And there are lots of good architects as well. I have nothing against architects, but since there's only 2 or 3 in the room, maybe I should start. Anyway, move on. Okay, so as I said, we'll come back to those various flavors of architect, but in order to understand what good or great architecture looks like, I think for me it was useful over the last few years to look at architecture stuff and identify what bad architecture practice might look like. So when I was thinking about this talk 4 or 5 months ago, I thought, well, I'm going to come up with what I consider to be architectural anti-patterns, because then I'm going to say, okay, well, how can we do better on those? So firstly, I just want to define what an anti-pattern is. An anti-pattern is not simply a bad idea. If you see somebody doing something, whatever it is, and it sounds like a rubbish idea, that does not qualify it as an anti-pattern. An anti-pattern has to be something that you see in lots and lots of different places, which allegedly solves a specific problem or a specific class of problems. As I say there, by the way, this definition comes off Wikipedia, but this is a useful definition. And then there's these 2 conditions. It usually seems to be a good idea at first, but then most importantly, condition number 2, that there's a better solution, right? So before you think something is an anti-pattern, you have to reason out, okay, well, what problem is this solving, and how can I do better at solving this problem? Okay, so Let's talk about some anti-patterns. And I changed the order of the following section, so if the numbering goes wrong, it's my fault, not Angus's. First anti-pattern. There he is, the architect. The technology police. Anybody seen this? An architect that goes around talking about a standard way of doing things? Yeah, a few people. I'm hoping that people have seen these anti-patterns, otherwise I'll be wasting my time a bit, but hey. I've come across these people so often. If you're not doing it this way, it's the wrong way. And, okay, why? Well, this is a ThoughtWorks thing. This is the ThoughtWorks Tech Radar, and I don't think this helps because people misinterpret this as if it's not in the inner ring, we're not going to do it. And I've seen people at clients go around and police the technology and say to people, this is the technology we're going to use. And what it tends to end up, the way it plays out is you have like governance procedures around a solution. Somebody in a development team who is attempting to optimize their work for speed of delivery of value to the client finds that they get completely blocked because the right tool for their job is not on this list. And then they have to go through loads and loads of governance procedure and meetings, and there might even be an architecture council or an architecture board that they have to apply to get something approved. And the whole thing makes you think, well, I could have done this in an hour. So what's the problem that it's trying to solve? Well, why do people think that we need to standardize on tools or implementations or anything? Well, I think it's a view that might have held some weight some time ago, and I think, in particular, I think about databases, and I think that databases used to be, if they still are in your organization, you can get therapy for it, but they used to be a massive coupling point for all of the stuff that you had to deal with. And what that meant is that every team had to have either knowledge of or some access to knowledge about that stuff, right? And also there was the fact that Oracle licenses cost loads and loads of money, so it probably made sense in the 1990s to think about standardizing on those tools from that perspective. And I think in particular, the way that we work now, I'm not so sure it's a problem that we should really be concerning ourselves with. We ought to be talking about optimizing, as I say, for speed of delivery. Therefore, the best tool for the job seems to make more sense to me in general. Okay, so my conclusion on anti-pattern 1 is basically, yeah, what problem are you trying to solve? Who is anti-pattern number 2? This is the framework designer. Has anybody worked with internal frameworks that are specifically built for that? Yeah, I pity your pain. Happened to me last year on a project I was working on, and this company had created a framework for their applications, let's call it. And the result of that was that nobody understood how to make the thing work. But there was an architect, a chief architect, that said, you have to use that. And I mean, I'm no fan of Spring or Spring Boot, but at the end of the day, we could have got it working in like 3 or 4 days using Spring. And I say to the guy, do you realize you've rebuilt Spring Boot? And you realize you've done it in a way that isn't very good? There's a massive team of developers that work on Spring Boot, right? They constantly, it's called Pivotal, right? That's the name of their company. They've got stacks and stacks of people whose job is just to do Spring Boot. Josh Long is a very great engineer. He showed me it in a pub once. It was brilliant. So why do people do this framework stuff? Well, what's the problem it's trying to solve? So again, I take a step back and say to this person, what is the problem you're trying to solve here? Tell me what the problem is. And this particular person that I'm thinking of couldn't really articulate a good response. Because we'd proved that the problem wasn't developer speed. And I wonder whether, and I've seen this happen in not the one I was just talking about, in a different place where they were outsourcing the major part of their development work to somewhere in the Far East. So they thought if they built a framework, then these Far East developers couldn't do too much damage. But what it ended up meaning was that actually they couldn't do any useful work either. They didn't damage anything, but they didn't get anything live either. So I wonder if the problem that's been trying to solve with this kind of dictator pattern, this framework design stuff, is I don't trust my developers to do the right thing. Maybe I've got a trust problem in my organization. Maybe I should be understanding what that trust problem is. Maybe I should be empowering them more. Maybe there's lots of things to be taken care of there. Where are my glasses? Excuse me. I'm just forgetting the order of the slides now. So, yeah, here's some reasons why I think people, they might want to build these highly opinionated frameworks. I strongly suspect that some architects do it for something to do. And I think they might be trying to, prove they're better than other people, but as I say, I think it's because of lack of trust. I reckon there was probably some historical reason for this, and as a consultant, what I often try and do is drill into the history of it. Why did you do that? What was the problem you were trying to solve at the time? And I think when it comes to frameworks, I think I would say, well, yeah, here's my history of it. This is my best guess about what can happen in these places. Something went wrong with a release. I hate it when that happens. You convert it from Google Slides and it looks perfect, and then you bring it down into PowerPoint and it wraps the text. So there was a bad release, right? Somebody got something wrong. So somebody big and clever says, let's make a framework, because then things can't go wrong. What then happens is it doesn't work for every case, right? So the lead times start blowing out. People are really struggling to return value. And then what does that mean? Well, the developers can't get stuff done. They start cutting corners. They start trying to use their guerrilla tech. So what does that mean? Well, you get bad releases. And the whole cycle perpetuates going forward. I can't remember who coined the phrase, but I think this is called a fear cycle. And you see them all the time. And it comes down to that. We don't trust our developers. So I think the core problem here that we need to try and solve is, let's trust our developers. Let's empower them and trust them to do stuff. So how could that play out? Well, build trust, build empathy, and I think, that last point, I didn't really mention this. Sometimes I think that people talk about portability of developers between teams as a reason for doing this sort of stuff. I don't buy that. The thing that stops developers being portable is the same thing that stops business people being portable. It's the context. It's not the tools you're using. So, is there even a problem to be solved? I think I could have combined these last two slides. I apologize. Yeah, there is one point. Frameworks can make sense when you've got a massive load of regulation, or standard code can make this company I was working in last year, they had to adhere to something called, I think it was HIPAA, medical type regulation. So my recommendation there is, don't write frameworks, but use libraries. Provide your software teams with libraries that they can choose to use if it fits their use case, or that they can maybe contribute to, make work for them, but don't do frameworks. And what my definition, or it's not my definition, a definition of a framework or a library is a framework runs your code, whereas your code runs library code. And if you think about things like that, you might find that you can reuse some standard things that might satisfy the regulators. Okay, so that's the framework designer anti-pattern. Has anybody come across librarians? I don't mean people that run libraries, I mean architect librarians. These are the people that are obsessed with documentation. They somehow think that if you spend so much time updating the wiki in a standardized way, your software will magically do what it's meant to do. Not quite sure where that assertion comes from. What problem are they trying to solve? Well, I suspect there's a desire within the organization to share knowledge better. I think that would probably be the thing there. In which case, my response would be, well, okay, it is writing some static documentation which is 10 pages long and is out of date as soon as you actually push that thing live. Is that the best way to do that? And they would also be obsessed with documenting upfront designs. Oh, gosh, okay. One thing I've picked out there, I do think that this type of thing is in danger of becoming risk management theatre. Is that a phrase that people have heard, risk management theatre? I don't think I invented it. In fact, I know I didn't invent it. So risk management theatre is a process that you end up doing because you do the process. So particularly if you've worked in banks, and if you do, I pity you, there will be lots and lots of teams whose day-to-day job is to service checklists in order to make sure they don't get blamed when things go wrong. That's risk management theatre, and I'll give you a real-world example of some risk management theatre in a moment. Oh yeah, there you go. There's an explanation of what it means. Yeah, teams that obstruct instead of enable. Teams sometimes add low value, and I think importantly, you find a lot where an organization is driven by process and loses sight of the outcomes that should be really important to them. I think documentation, over-documentation, is a big part of that. Just to illustrate risk management theatre, this is something that I saw when I was walking to the town centre where I live in Hemel Hempstead with my daughter a few months ago. Can everybody read that sign? Yeah, caution, broken glass. And interestingly, if you look at this picture, you'll see that they've gone to a great deal of effort to prevent anybody getting near the broken glass. You can't quite see it, but up there, that barrier thing is actually fixed to those metal railings by chains. So people have gone to a lot of trouble here. You might be wondering where the broken glass is, so I'll help you out. It's there. I'll zoom in for you. There, can you see it now? And it's my belief that what happened here is somebody made a process. A long time ago, somebody got cut on some broken glass, and whoever is responsible for this area, it's actually at the bottom of a residential block, came up with a procedure that says, this is how we stop people hurting themselves on broken glass. Number one, secure the area. Those fences stayed in that position for 3 weeks. Now, for at least 3 weeks. From the first time I saw them till the last time I saw them, it was a 3-week gap. One has to ask themselves, how much did it cost to put those fences up? And why didn't the person just pick the glass up? That would have been the outcome we were looking for. So that's what risk management theatre is, and I think that documentation can be an example of that. So my advice with that type of work is, always ask yourself, what is the problem to which this is the proposed solution? And as I mentioned, if it's a communication problem, communicate better. Just communicate better. Stand up, go and talk to people. Walk around your building. You know, make sure everybody can talk to everybody else. Do showcases, do show and tells, do lunchtime sessions where you show off what you've done. Do stuff like that. Build a community. Communicate better. Okay, my final anti-pattern, which is probably my favorite one, and I did invent this word, Architectology. This is where you have experts, they're often known as enterprise architects in the business, to whom you must get approval of any plan when you're attempting to return some value to your business. How does it play out? Well, you may be an architect, so if your job title has architect in it, you never write code, let's be honest, if you're one of these people. What you do is you've worked on a lot of systems in your company. Maybe this goes back to the person we were talking about earlier who represents a tribe. You go around and talk to a lot of tech leads about what they do and how they do stuff, and particularly you will use that phrase a lot, your system. What does your system do? What does your system do? What does your system do? You're going to draw a lot of diagrams. The talk before was about diagrams, wasn't it? These people draw a load of diagrams. And often they have that heading, current state. And then in another meeting, they'll draw another diagram with the title, future state. But you know what? You know you're never going to get there. So, and this phrase is one of your stock phrases. This is how we do it. So, well, oh yeah, you go to a lot of committee meetings. I'm sure architects do this a lot, particularly this type of architect. And you negotiate between teams. You talk about who's going to do what, and most disturbingly, you spend a lot of time coordinating releases, right? Because there's probably a load of high coupling in your organization. So if all of that's true, well, firstly, I would be scared about that. And secondly, you may well be an architectologist, which is somebody that combines architecture with archaeology. They do code archaeology. They do systems archaeology. And their role is to pass that knowledge somehow to people. So this is how it plays out. Here's our hero software developer. She's running a team and she's saying, I want to do something really simple to derive some new value, right? It's brand new value, it's a new functionality. How do I do this? Well, the architectologist gets involved and says, oh, that's easy. Talk to this person, talk to that person, talk to that person, then you'll get it done. Meanwhile, the tech lead is thinking, it shouldn't be this hard. So she starts talking to everybody in the organization as directed, and she comes up against this response quite often. Yeah, I know exactly what my system does. I can explain exactly what it does, and then she'll say to this person, why does it do it? And this person says, I don't know. My system converts XML from this format to this format. Yeah, but why? What customer outcome does it drive? And you'll find that in such an organization, a lot of tech leads that own this little island of tech somewhere just don't know. So solving your simple problem can end up looking like this. And this slide, it's been rebranded now. It used to look like it was ThoughtWorks. Now it looks like Codurance, which is cool. This was a genuine slide that we put together in a thing I was on 2 or 3 years ago, where the lady in the top left is a real person. She's called Karen, and she wanted to do something dead simple. We went to the client and said, well, it sounds like it should take, a day. It ended up taking us 3 weeks. And all of these people in the picture were new people. We kept getting told, oh, no, you need to talk to that person, you need to talk to that person. Then it was like, oh, God, a new system gets introduced we've never heard of. The thing went on forever. And what that taught us was this is what architectology is. Right? The architects were telling us, talk to them, talk to them, talk to them, talk to them. And we were going, God, we could have done this 3 weeks ago. So what problem is architectology trying to solve? Well, I think there are 2 genuine problems that a lot of businesses have. And this is the common response to it, is to call these people enterprise architects and make them the people that know everything. So I think the first problem they're trying to solve is they've got a lot of legacy systems. Okay, is that a problem? Well, not a problem in and of itself, but probably a bigger problem is that someone considers them business critical. And I always challenge that. I would say to people, is that thing business critical there, or is the functionality you derive from it business critical? And having that conversation can help people to move on from the obsession of a thing being business critical. There's going to be a lot of tight coupling. And that's part of there being lots of legacy, because if this stuff is 20 years old, well, we didn't know about REST 20 years ago. It might have been the twinkle in someone's eye, but I certainly hadn't heard of it 20 years ago. We certainly didn't have Kafka event streams and all that stuff. And the other problem that it's trying to overcome, and I think this is part of the same problem, is loads of knowledge silos. You've probably got horizontally stratified businesses. There's lots of knowledge silos everywhere. And people are thinking you've got to go through all those knowledge silos to get stuff done. And as I think I already mentioned this, those silos are interesting, I think, because often they understand what they do, but they don't know why they do it. And actually, your tech lead, your person at the front of the value stream, is really interested in why stuff happens, not what that stuff is. Because actually, the what is not important. The why is important, and the outcome is important. So I think that's the problem it's trying to solve. So as promised, I need to truly call this an anti-pattern. I need to come up with a better solution. So what's the better solution? I hope this is the next slide, otherwise I've got my ordering wrong. Oh no, first of all, more bad consequences than good ones. Yeah, I think we all know this. Yeah, those are the bad consequences. And I think basically we've all experienced this. In such an environment, it just takes ages to get anything done. And also it perpetuates the legacy. Your silos grow and then defend themselves. They become an empire. The people within the silo probably end up thinking, you know what, I'm still using Oracle 3 or something. I'm still using Java version N-5. I'm not going to get a job anywhere else. So I need to keep my job here. So they become defensive. They start to defend themselves. So what's the documented, repeatable, proven solution? Well, tackle the core problem, which is silos and legacy. Don't live with it. Actually start to solve, why have I got silos? Why have I got legacy? How would I do that? Build a cross-functional team. Empower that team to own its whole outcome. And I think really importantly, talk about products. Talk in terms of funding products, not funding projects, right? The thing that you're building will live forever. So it needs funding forever. Yeah, and here's some implementation. Isolate the legacy. Build APIs around it. Build, shims, whatever. Use the strangler pattern. You decouple them. Decouple your systems, decouple your teams, everybody's happy. And I think you've probably got a group of architects who are worried about this type of thinking because they think they don't have a job. Well, repurpose them. Tell them to create value across a whole value stream. Tell them we're no longer interested in systems, we're interested in outcomes. So I think if you do that, hopefully people get happier. Nice smiley, I've never seen that graphic before. Better than the old ThoughtWorks one. Cool. So those are some anti-patterns. So what does good architecture look like? So just a few little sort of tips, and maybe I've already mentioned these, but I think it's worth repeating. So yeah, don't follow the anti-patterns. A big thing that I've said for years is think about your outcomes, not about how you get there. I'm going to start with a little story to illustrate one of my points. This is a genuine thing. Anybody recognize that building? I'll be shocked if you do. It's not a great example of architecture. That is Leicester Forest Services. It's on the M1, somewhere, near Leicester probably. I am quite familiar with this service station because I live near London and I go to a lot of stag do's up north, or I used to when I was a bit younger. And whenever we drove back from Leeds or Manchester or Liverpool, we generally stopped at these services for lunch, with a massive hangover. And I always look forward to it because there's a KFC up there on that ramp. And this one day that this photo came from, I'd spent the week working in Darlington. Does anybody know Darlington? Does anybody want to go to Darlington? Yeah, okay. So I worked in Darlington that week. Driving was a terrible idea. I should have got the train. I was driving home really, really tired, and I was looking forward all the way down the motorway to stopping here to have dinner on the way home. And of course, I was going to have KFC. Now, one thing that's always annoyed me about this service station is this. There's a Burger King there, right next door to KFC, and this advert is constantly up. And if you can see that, it's a bit crap, the picture. It's an advert for their chicken products. Now, you know what? If I'm going to buy a chicken product, I ain't going to buy it from the Burger King that is next door to the KFC. So that particular advert always wound me up. And every time I saw it, I just would go, why are they doing that? Talk about what you do well. Talk about burgers. Tell me to buy burgers. So I walk up there on this day, really tired, looking forward to KFC. And what do I find? Well, the KFC is closed. Very disappointing. So I thought, okay, second prize, I'll go for a double Whopper with cheese or whatever. Now, the important thing you need to see here is this notice that's pinned up here on the Burger King there. Well, what does the notice say? Unfortunately, I didn't get close enough to take it, but I can zoom in on the text for you. That's pretty disappointing. This is before I went vegetarian, this story, by the way. And I refuse to try Burger King vegetarian products. So I read that and thought, oh, God. Well, you can have chicken or vegetarian. I ain't going to go for the vegetarian at this point. And there's an apology. So I'm just, oh, God, what do I do? Well, so I was forced to buy a Burger King chicken product, which cannot possibly be as good as a KFC product, can it? So I sit down thinking, oh, God, here I go. I ate this thing. It was the best chicken I've ever eaten in my life. Absolutely amazing. Why am I saying this? Well, because in business now, as in your architecture that supports your business, the only thing that you can be certain about is that it will change. The only thing that you can be certain that gives you competitive advantage within your business over your competitors is in your ability to deal with change. That's what we need to be thinking about when we talk about architecture. So how can we do that? How can we be agile? Well, stage number one, does anybody recognize this man? It's Melvin Conway, of course. Make Conway's law work for you. Stage number one, I think, in any well-architected business is to architect the business around the business outcomes you want. Make teams that own the whole outcome. Sit your business people with your software people. Encourage people to use the right tool for the right job. Empower them to make those decisions. So that will set you up and get you going. Leave your architects, if you decide to have a layer of architects, to concentrate on the cross-cutting concerns like, you know what, we need a corporate SSO solution, right? Or we need some kind of corporate infrastructure to pipe our logs into an elastic stack, whatever. Architects can deal with that, right? Great. Here's my second mantra, my second piece of advice, and I think you've heard me say this. Understand the problem you are trying to solve. How many times will people come to you with a solution masquerading as a problem? One of my favorite questions is, hey, what's the problem to which this is the proposed solution? And you know what? If people can't answer that, ask, what are we doing, right? And then with processes, you know, what does this process do? Another question we always used to ask, or I still ask, is what outcome is this process supporting? And if people can't articulate a good answer to that, question if it's actually risk management theater. And then when you've got these solutions in place, understand how to measure success. I'll come back to that in a bit. I think it's fine to talk about architectural principles. Not to be a dictator, but to be an advisor. And I strongly advise architects to think in these terms. If you can pass down architectural principles and trust your teams to stick to those principles, you know, maybe have some sort of light governance around it, that's going to be much better than dictating what they can't do. So there you go. There's some principles you might have. Prefer libraries over frameworks. Business outcomes over systems. Or we value the right tool for the right job over unnecessary standardization. It's really useful to frame value statements in that comparative fashion. Tell people what's good and what's not so good. 12-factor applications, that's got a decent set of principles that you might want to say, let's stick to these, for example. So that's good architecture, I think. There's some advice on good architecture. But this is my main point, I think. What does great architecture look like? So I'm not going to talk about specific decisions, right? Because I can't advise anybody on those specific decisions. But one thing that's always struck me as odd with architecture, and we're only starting now to understand this a bit better, is people generally, throughout my career up until very recently, take architectural decisions based on what they think is the right thing to do. So that's, I think, can be why there's lots of committee decisions on things. We want to decouple, right? So we're going to do this thing. Okay, how do you know you're more decoupled now than before is a question that I've been asking for a few years. Let's think about that. So the first thing I'm going to say on this point before I delve into that in more detail is be careful what you measure. This is a quote from Eli Goldratt. If you tell me what you're going to measure, I'll tell you how I behave. Classic example of this is that primary schools do SATs. My children, my older daughter's been through it, my little girl's doing it now. What does that mean? It means they spend their year 6 in primary school doing nothing but learning how to pass an exam that's worthless to them in future life. But they do that because the school knows it's being measured on it. So be careful about imposing too many measurements, and I am going to talk a bit about what to measure and how to measure it, but just be careful. Everything you measure will change behavior. So that's my caveat to everything that I'm going to say for the remainder of the talk, which won't be too long. I apologize for keeping everybody for so long. So, embrace architectural fitness functions. Has anybody read a book called Building Evolutionary Architectures? Yeah, there's one or two. So, it's on my slide at the end. If you haven't read that book, I firmly recommend that you read it. So this is the notion that I am going to change something in my architecture. Up until now, until we talk about fitness functions, that change, we are just going to kind of know if it was a good idea or not know if it was a good idea. So let's say we're going to replace RabbitMQ with a Kafka stream, right? That's got wide implications for everything in my system. How do I know that that was a good idea? Right? Is anybody measuring the effect of this change? Is anybody understanding the state we started at and the state we'd like to get to and what changes from here to here? So, the book that I mentioned, Building Evolutionary Architecture, talks about fitness functions, talks about saying, what are we going to measure the improvement of which shows that our overall system is healthier? So let's find a way to measure scalability. Let's find a way to measure portability. Let's find a way to measure all the things that end in ility, right? Decoupledness. Let's find a way to understand how decoupled our system is. Then I think if you've done that well, you'll have a series of stuff that is your architectural fitness. You won't have absolute numbers in mind for most of them. You might do if it's, say, a performance metric over, say, response times. But generally speaking, you'll just know that if the number goes that way, it's good. If it goes that way, it's bad. Just look at those numbers. Understand how you're measuring your system and look at those numbers over time. Maybe you can set some alerts on them, right? Maybe you've got them on a massive dashboard. So we're gonna roll out a new architectural thing tomorrow, right? Well, hopefully you don't do it in a big bang, you do it in stages. But every time we change something, we're gonna monitor these fitness functions going forward. So on day n, we can always compare to day n-1 and see if our architecture is better. So the key point is, if we start doing this and we embrace this, architecture will stop being a question of my judgment and what I think is a good idea versus a bad idea. It starts to become empirically measurable. So, how do we define fitness functions? This is the million-dollar question. Well, I'm not sure. I've got some ideas. Is that what the next slide says? Let me just bear in mind. Yeah. So here's some examples of fitness functions. So what we want to do is try and find ways to measure the whole system, okay? But also we want to target stuff on smaller things. And the book is very clear on this. Unit tests are fitness functions, right? They're very targeted fitness functions that tell us about a specific piece of code, but they are fitness functions. All sorts of tests that hopefully everybody in this room is writing all the time, they are fitness functions. So we understand them well, right? And we should be looking at them in conjunction with other things. We've probably got something like Gatling doing performance tests. That's a fitness function. Hopefully that'll throw up a red flag if my response times diminish. Diminish? Get longer. You can use, and I did this, we started to do this last year in the work I was doing. We started to look at our pipelines, our Jenkins pipelines, and started to use that to start getting interesting data out. How often are we doing deliveries? How often are we doing deliveries that fail? How often are we rolling back? Things like that give us architectural fitness functions. If my system is more decoupled, I will do more deliveries. I will do more releases to production. So be creative around your fitness functions, but measure them and understand what they mean. In a company I was working at just before I moved to Codurance, people said to us, how do you know that you're succeeding in decoupling systems? And I was like, that's a tough one. But our suggestion was, you know what? Let's pick a group of tech leads, whoever they are, and architects, if you've got them. I forget the exact cohort we said. Let's measure the amount of time these people spend in meetings. Because if the systems are decoupled or more decoupled, they'll spend less time in meetings. It's not a perfect measure, but it's a good measure. And it gives us a good enough way of measuring a trend over time. We're more decoupled now because these people are on average only spending 3 hours a week in meetings, whereas 3 months ago they were spending 6 hours. So there you go. You can be creative. You can find ways of doing that. And that one was a good one because we could query whatever the thing was, probably Outlook or something, to get that data. Has anybody in this room read this book apart from the people in Codurance whose throats I shoved it down? Great, so some people have. Accelerate, written by those people. Jez Humble used to be a colleague of mine. Never met him, actually. Very nice man, I'm told. Middle name shouldn't be. Anyway, the 4 key metrics. This book is based on, I think, 8 years of research into the State of DevOps report. A really key finding is this. These 4 metrics here, lead time, deployment frequency, mean time to restore, no, not uptime, mean time to restore, and change fail percentage. Those metrics are very, very tightly correlated with the overall business performance of your business. These, I cannot stress enough, are the most important things to measure. I am yet to come across people, certainly in my consultancy career, that actually measure these, because companies that understand and measure these are probably on the high end of the scale and don't need consultants. So we started to make the measurement of these the first thing that we did on all new clients that we went to. Because I guarantee you, if you can think of any, what we would call, say, a subjective improvement to architecture, you will see an improvement in these things. As I say, just think about it. If you decouple your system, which is something that's hard to measure, decouplement, you'll increase your deployment frequency, right? Because the teams won't have to have these committee meetings about what they're going to deploy. So for me, I think the link is clear. If you measure these 4 things, make a good change, you will improve these metrics. So think about those metrics, think about measuring them and moving on to them. Then, how do we improve? And fortunately, the book also gives us a good guide, and this is something we started doing at ThoughtWorks and we're starting to now implement at Codurance. The book tells us that there are 24 key capabilities, split into those 5 categories. Continuous delivery is the first one, and it's got 7 or 8 capabilities in it. For example, capability number 1 is source code control. So the question is, how good is your source code control? Is everything under source control? Or, you know what, does somebody do some kind of stuff on the side? Is someone maintaining an Excel spreadsheet for stuff? So the idea is, this is my advice. Every team can do this on an iterative basis. Sit down, well, stage number 1, measure the 4 key metrics on a team level. Okay, it doesn't have to be consistent across teams because there'll be different ways of measuring deployment frequency, but keep it consistent with each team going forward. Then every couple of weeks, you have a meeting, you list out the 24 capabilities, not necessarily the cultural one because that's on an organizational level, and you basically get together as a team and say, which of these are we crap at? What is our biggest problem, right? Do this every couple of weeks, sit down and say, you might conclude, oh, well, our biggest problem is this, it's this capability. Then sit down as a team, spend half an hour, whatever you need, come up with an action point to fix that thing, right? And then do that, make sure it happens, give that an owner, move forward. And then a couple of weeks later, ask yourself the same question. Hopefully, what you decided was your biggest problem 2 weeks ago is no longer your biggest problem. So then fix that biggest problem. And I've seen this in action, I've seen it work. This type of thinking will improve your 4 key metrics. Improving your 4 key metrics will definitely improve your architecture and will definitely improve your business performance. That is my takeaway of my last sort of year or so of consultancy work when I started to work more and more with the higher level enterprise type architecture. So my conclusion is beware of those architectural anti-patterns, run a mile, or maybe fix them. Always ask why. Now, this doesn't just go for architecture, but always ask why. Why are we doing this? What's the problem to which this is the proposed solution? What's the outcome we're looking for from this thing? Choose enabling your teams over controlling them. Enable them, empower them. I can't stress that highly enough. Talk about outcomes over systems, right? Your systems aren't important, the outcomes they drive are important. Define fitness functions. Don't rely on gut feelings or vague cross-functional requirements. Define those fitness functions and iterate on them. And you probably guess what these last 2 bullet points are. Measure the 4 key metrics. If you're not measuring them, talk about how to do it. Do it tomorrow. No, don't, because you'll be at the conference tomorrow. Do it on Monday. And iterate on the 24 capabilities. And I hope that if you take on board some of that, then you'll be the Codurance smiley again. And thank you very much for listening. Do we have time for questions?
Unfortunately not. Thanks, James. Okay, so we're going to break now for lunch. We're back in here at 2:30.